Jimmy Carter will be remembered as a man of faith, principle, and charity. Though once remembered as a good man but not a great president, there is a growing consensus among historians today that our collective memory of Carter needs to be recollected. This is Jason Lee Guthrie, host of the Recollecting Carter podcast. On this series finale, I revisit some highlights from previous episodes and end with some final recollections of my own.
Today's trip, you will hear this sound. That will work.
On spring, summer, and fall Saturdays in South Georgia, there's only one way to explore the birthplace of Jimmy Carter.
As we begin today's trip, we would like to direct your attention to a few rules.
It's a step back in time, as they say, on Georgia's rolling state park. The Savannah, Americus, and Montgomery, or SAM, short line train runs all sorts of special events and excursions throughout the year. But the presidential flyer is their signature route and their most popular ticket. Departing from Cordele, Georgia, close to I-75, the ride does feel like a step back in time as you leave modern city life behind, riding through groves of loblolly pines and across the waters of Lake Blackshear. Depending on the schedule, the Sam Short Line might make stops in Archery at Carter's boyhood home, Americus, where he attended college, and of course at the depot in downtown Plains, where he launched his presidential campaign. Carter was born in Plains and still lives there today. On this episode of Recollecting Carter, I want to invite you to take this ride with me and learn more about President Jimmy Carter's life and legacy.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear. The time for racial discrimination is over. That I will faithfully execute
an undiminished, ever-expanding American dream.
The office of President of the United States.
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
And will, to the best of my ability,
It is a crisis of confidence
preserve, protect, and defend
to remove the light of war, the threat of war, would be the overwhelming dream that I would have.
the Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
If you're in Plains, Georgia, and you want to know more about President Jimmy Carter, there's one person you need to ask.
I'm Jill Stuckey, and I'm the superintendent of Jimmy Carter National Historical Park. My late husband was a fundraiser for candidate Carter back in the 70s. I married my husband in 1995. We were dating in 1994, and I was a huge Carter fan, so he arranged for a meeting, and I've basically been working with them ever since.
If you had a classroom of middle schoolers in the state history class here in Georgia and they were visiting the facility and you were introducing them to Plains, introducing them to where Carter grew up, how would you start that narrative?
So President and Mrs. Carter were both born here in Plains. President Carter was the first president to be born in a hospital because his mother was working there. Basically, nobody was born in a hospital back in 1924 when he was born. But his mother was very pregnant. She came to the doctor while she was at work at the hospital and said, I think I'm having my baby. So he said, well, instead of going home, let's just, go in a room and we'll have it here. So that's a typical trivia question that is asked. But President Carter was born, like I say, here in Plains. The Smith family, Rosalind Carter Smith's family, was next door. And when Rosalind was born, little 3-4-year-old Jimmy went next door and peeked into the bassinet and first laid eyes on his wife. But The Carters had a typical life here in Plains. They were farmers. His father was a very good businessman. He had stores and was in the peanut industry and agriculture industry. And so little Jimmy worked on the farm. They moved out to Archery, Georgia, which was a few miles outside of town, and they were surrounded by tenant farmers. These were African American farmers that were Jimmy's best friends. He grew up with these people. And I think that's why President Carter, to this day, works with African Americans, tries to help African Americans have equality as much as he does.
Yeah, he's talked about that really openly in public, how much that experience shaped him. Can you share a little bit more on that? What are some of his favorite stories that he likes to share about growing up and the experience of growing up in the racially segregated American South?
Jimmy really didn't realize there was too much of a difference when he was very young, till the days when he started going into town and he started realizing on the train there were different places for him to ride and his black friends to ride. And he tells the story when he was 14 years old that they were all playing in the field. They were running up to this gate, and all the other black children stopped to let him go through first. And he thought, oh, there's a tripwire or something. But what had happened, their parents had told them that Jimmy was now a man. He was of age, so they had to start treating him differently. So they stopped and let Jimmy go through, and that really stuck in his mind.
You mentioned Jimmy coming of age. What did that look like? Growing up through the Depression, and then as he was a teenager, it was about the time of World War II. What was that experience like for him?
Times were tough then, but Jimmy was very savvy in business. So Jimmy would harvest peanuts and boil them, go down on the streets of Plains, which was a busy mercantile place when he was young. He would set up and sell the peanuts, and he got enough money to buy some old rickety houses, which he fixed up and rented. And he was very early on very much business savvy and wanted to be self-sustaining even at teenage years.
The self-sustaining part is probably not unfamiliar to a student of Carter or just a student of history that kind of knows about that image that was cultivated for him as a president. But the business savvy part, maybe less so. He was always kind of known as the peanut farmer from Plains, but he was much more than that. Talk a little bit about those late teen years leaving public school here in Plains and the college years and his career that followed.
He graduated after the 11th grade because back in the day, there was only 11 grades here in Plains. So he got out of school, went to college first in Americas, and then from there went to Georgia Tech, and then from there got the appointment to the Naval Academy. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 3 years. He was on a ship and a submarine and loved the seas, loved traveling, didn't like being away from Roseland and the family too much, but he was very dedicated to serving his country and helping every way he could.
Let's talk a little bit about that romance between Jimmy and Roseland. What age did they start to develop a courtship, and how did that relationship progress into the lifelong marriage that it's become?
There was 3 years difference. And as you know, when you're kids, 3 years is a long time. So he really didn't know Roseland to speak of when he was in high school. But he came home from the military academy, and his girlfriend had a family reunion. So he was kind of looking for somebody to spend the weekend with. And Roseland was good friends with Jimmy's sister. And Roseland likes to tell the story. She actually fell in love with Jimmy's picture in her best friend's bedroom, the picture of Jimmy in the Naval Academy. So they went out And Jimmy came home that night from the date and told his mother, I met the girl I'm going to marry. But Rosalind was a little bit hard to get because she had promised her father before he died that she would finish college. So he asked her a few times to marry him before she finally said yes. But they got married. They went to Chimney Rock for their honeymoon. We were talking about that the other day, and it put a big smile on both their faces to talk about their honeymoon trip to the mountains. But they have been partners and just about inseparable ever since.
You can't talk about the beauty of the love story without also talking about their children and, of course, now grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But tell us a little bit about their kids.
So a lot of people come here to Jimmy Carter Historical Park, and they only think that the Carters had one child, which they actually had 4 children. They had 3 boys. And then President Carter likes to say, we had a 13-year argument, and then we had Amy. So Amy grew up basically in the governor's mansion and in the White House. The boys and the family are very, very essential to the Carters. They spend a lot of time with their family. Every year they go on vacation. They would take everybody in their family. They would take their 4 children. They would take their children and grandchildren and go any place in the world that the family wanted to go and spend a week, in the week between Christmas and New Year's. And they would be at the Carter Center a lot. 3 of the 4 children live in metropolitan Atlanta. So they would have dinners every month at the Carter Center, or more often. They would go visit their children. The children come here to Plains, just, like a typical family. They love each other and want to be with each other.
Like a typical family, just with the Secret Service escort.
Exactly.
You mentioned that we're here at the historical site. Tell us a little bit about all of the facilities that are around that are connected to Carter. It's a relatively rural part of southern Georgia, and it's indelibly linked now to Jimmy Carter and his legacy and the prestige of being the birthplace of a president. So there's lots of historical places around. As much as you can paint a picture with words, describe all the things that you could see if you want to come to Plains and the surrounding area and learn about President Carter.
The Park Service has 4 sites here. We have the building we're in, which is a 100-year-old schoolhouse that the Carters attended grades 1 through 11. We have the depot in downtown Plains, which is where President Carter started his campaign for president. We have President Carter's boyhood farm, where he moved to in 1928 when he was 4 years old and stayed there till he was 17, till he went to college. And then we actually have the Carter's house and the area where they will be buried, right in front of their house. So when the Carters are both deceased, the Park Service will take over the house and turn it into, hopefully, a museum so people can walk in and see the house that the Carters built in 1961, where they still live today, which is very surprising to a lot of people that somebody of President and Mrs. Carter's stature would live in the same house that they built in 1961. It's a 3-bedroom ranch house, just a typical house that would have been built in the 1960s. There's nothing fancy about it. Anwar Sadat walked into the house and looked around and said, well, where's the main house? This is it. They are not pretentious people. They haven't upgraded the kitchen or the bathroom. It's just like it was. It's good enough for them. They don't need anything fancy. They like to put their money and their work into focusing on helping others instead of making their surroundings fancy.
Let's talk a little bit about that work. You mentioned the Carter Center. A lot of the humanitarian work that the Carters do is done under the auspices, obviously, of the Carter Center. I'm especially interested to hear, how is that work received and interpreted locally here? When you talk about Carter in town, in a rural southern area, how is Carter talked about and remembered? How is that legacy filtered in real time?
There's basically 2 different sides. There's people that think pretty much everything he did was wonderful and is doing is wonderful. And there are people that just don't like him at all. A little bit about what they have done since they left the presidency. So they started the Carter Center very early on, and the Carter Center does work on a few different areas. They work with fair and open elections and making sure that people have the ability to vote for candidates that they want and choose. They do a lot with mental health. That's what Rosalind has focused on in most of her career. And then they're eradicating and eliminating diseases. So there are literally hundreds of millions of people that aren't blind or don't have worms growing out of their body due to the work of the Carters. It's funny, I went to church with the Carters when he was teaching Sunday school. A few times I would get to talk before President Carter came on, and, there'd be 400 people in there. And I'd say, okay, what has President Carter been doing since he's no longer president? And all the hands go up in the room and they say, Habitat for Humanity. And don't get me wrong, Habitat for Humanity is phenomenal. They're a great organization. But I say, yeah, they do that 1 week out of the year. What do they do the other 51 weeks out of the year? And here again, it's a case where the Carters don't blow their own horn. They quietly go about doing their work without a lot of fanfare. But when they build a house, they get a lot of attention. They're working with folks like Garth and Tricia, and they're doing a lot of it here in this country. So it's on TV and radio, and that's what people know about them. But there's a lot more about the Carters if you just look a little further beneath the surface.
As someone who is in charge of running a historical site, you have a lot of interaction with people from the public that come in, want to visit. And so you get to hear that wide range of views about Carter. What are some of the most common conceptions of who Carter was as a president? And you mentioned some as a post-president. And what are some of the ones that you would really characterize as misconceptions that you think that either the historical record got wrong or the media got wrong, but they're just ones that you notice that people come in again and again and kind of repeat a certain narrative, and maybe that narrative is incorrect?
So, a lot of people come in and say, oh, he's a good ex-president, which really they don't know the true history. And a lot of the true history is coming out now. So there's a lot of misconceptions in history, but I think the record is being corrected in a lot of cases now. There's been some books that have come out that have really spotlighted these misconceptions, and people were starting to take another look at his presidency. For the most part, these have all been very favorable perceptions that have come out.
Why don't we end up by talking about some of those favorable aspects? What do you think are some of the key aspects of his legacy, whether part of the presidency or part of the post-presidency, that are the most important things for someone to know about who Carter is and what he's achieved?
The Middle East peace treaty that still has not been broken between Begin and Sadat was huge. Doubling the size of the National Park Service was huge. And I think had we listened to him on his energy policy, he had put into place a way that we could be totally energy independent by the year 2000. Had we done that, the next administration did away with those policies. But just think where we would be if we would have been totally independent with our energy by the year 2000. I think we'd be in a lot better place. Developing or creating the Department of Education, the Department of Energy were huge. What he has done afterwards and what he is still doing with the Carter Center, with Habitat for Humanity, and now he has started what is called the Carter Plains Foundation, where he is trying to eradicate substandard housing in Plains. So Carter Plains Foundation has put about 17 new roofs on houses in Plains, about 14 new HVAC systems, has bettered the lives of a number of people right here in Plains, where he kind of sticks around here these days. So wherever he is going to help people. That's one of both their mottos, because they are true partners.
I'm walking up Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., in between the U.S. Capitol and the White House. It's the same route incoming American presidents take after their inauguration. Jimmy Carter famously decided to get out of the presidential limousine along with his family and walk the route, a tradition that's been followed by every president since. That walk was and is remembered as one of the iconic moments of Carter's presidency. It embodied the authentic, uncelebrity appeal that made his campaign so successful at connecting with everyday Americans. One of my favorite things about making this podcast has been learning about President Carter not just from historians and scholars, but hearing stories from people who were there when history happened.
I'm Terry Johnson. I'm the chair of the Department of Visual and Performing Arts at Clayton State University in Morrow, Georgia.
Tell us a little bit about your background, how you have a personal connection with Carter, and I think you've got a specific story that is going to be really interesting for us.
Well, I grew up in the household of two Georgia teachers. My dad changed positions from teaching in the School of Education at Georgia Southern College to being the academic dean at Georgia Southwestern College in Americus, Georgia, when I was about 8 years old. So we moved to Americus, and one of my early memories there was our dad taking us to the National Guard Armory, which was, just as you imagine, a small town open building in Americus, where a local farmer was going to appear and announce that he was running for governor of the state of Georgia. So my first time meeting Jimmy Carter came at that announcement. I don't remember the year of that, but it would have been shortly after we moved to Americas. My dad got very interested in Jimmy Carter at first because he was an alumnus of Georgia Southwestern. Like many of Georgia's state colleges, it had begun as a two-year college, and Jimmy Carter attended it as a two-year college in preparation then to go to Georgia Tech, where, of course, everyone knows that he studied nuclear engineering. So, of course, my dad was interested in him, but then, of course, we became fans. We became followers of his political ideas and believed very much in especially the ideas that he had about racial reconciliation, about racial integration, in his kind of incorruptible spirit that stayed true through his time in the State House and in the White House, where there was never any allegation of corruption as a politician. And, of course, he was a neighbor. Plains is about 7 or 8 miles outside the city limits of Americus. Americus is the county seat for Sumter County. So Plains residents were very much our neighbors. We even had Plains kids who came into the city schools of Americus to attend school because the Plains school system was part of the Sumter County system, and the schools were much smaller, didn't offer all the extracurriculars and things like that. So we grew up knowing the Carters, and his sons are a little bit older than me. His daughter Amy is a little bit younger than me. So I didn't grow up with his kids, but I had a good friend in high school from Plains who was Amy's babysitter. And that, of course, was quite a calling card after he became president. And she was very proud of having played a role in Amy's upbringing.
You've made a life and career out of music. And you have an interesting story that connects with Carter and your early musical career. So tell us a little bit about that.
When I was in junior high and high school, I was one of those kids that we now affectionately call a band geek. Everything about me was band. I was a percussionist and played in, of course, the junior high and then senior high bands. As a junior and senior in high school, became the drum major of the band. Well, it was interesting that as Carter had served as governor, he had become kind of a household name, and it wasn't unusual to see him at, ribbon cuttings and at speaking for commencement and that kind of thing. But I remember very well being in high school, being at church supper one Wednesday night, like everyone, of course, went to, and somebody came in the door and said, "You're not going to believe this, but Jimmy Carter just announced he's running for president." And we all had the biggest laugh about that. We thought, a peanut farmer from Sumter County running for president. Of course, we were proven wrong, and it wasn't long before we were on the bandwagon wholeheartedly. But as a high schooler who was involved in the high school band, we immediately started getting involved in the campaign because there would be a rally, there would be a parade, there would be an announcement that all were being generated out of either Plains, Georgia, at that very familiar railroad depot there on the one street that runs through the center of Plains, or perhaps even in Americus, where I remember being involved in the opening of the library and Jimmy Carter being there as a presidential candidate. The library at Georgia Southwestern, where my dad was an administrator, is the James Earl Carter Library, named for Jimmy Carter's father, who was a board member of the college. And so it wasn't unusual to be around him and to be doing something musical. And so pretty soon our band directors got an arrangement of the song Happy Days Are Here Again, which was the campaign slogan song, and we memorized it and we pitched up and played it as many times as sometimes once or twice a week throughout my junior and senior years in high school. And during the summer of 1976, which was the summer between those junior and senior years for me, there were campaign rallies just about every Tuesday night. And we even gave our time in the summer, even though we weren't in school. We would, as many of us as were available, would go down to Plains. The Carters would have gone out on what came to be known as the Peanut Brigade. They would take the Amtrak train or something like that and go to some part of the country where they were campaigning. And then they would return. They would do it with volunteers who went over the weekend. And so they would return to Plains by Monday or Tuesday, and they'd have a big rally. And there we would be playing Happy Days Are Here Again. And it became our summer kind of fun thing that we did. Well, when school started, the Democratic convention had happened. He was the nominee. It was a very close race between him and President Ford. And those rallies continued. And in addition to playing for our high school football games and all the normal high school band things, we spent a lot of time in Plains. And we spent enough time down there that the campaign staff, especially the local office, pretty much came to view us as part of the campaign and would not hesitate to call our director and ask for us to be present, and we would always oblige if we could. And so it came to be that on election night in November of 1976, we were there, and we were there all night. We had buses, even though we had many times we had just driven ourselves out to Plains to play, but this time we brought school buses so that they could run with the heaters going because it was a very cold night in November. And we would play. We played not just Happy Days Are Here Again, but a lot of songs to entertain the crowd. Plains, which has 600 or 800 residents, had, thousands and thousands of people roaming the downtown area. And so we were stationed at one end of the main street, and we played as frequently as they asked us to. As the night went on and the tension grew, it was clear that it was a very close race. We just continued to play, and especially play when the news coverage would roll. And then in between, we'd go to the buses, and they would turn them on, and we would warm up with the heat or doze off. And then, 45 minutes later, we would pile out and get our instruments and play again. And somewhere along in that series of times that we played, we were standing there. As the drum major, I was directing the band, and someone came up to me from the campaign staff, and they were carrying a press pass, which you think now of the credentials people have to be around the president, and it's a laminated, probably bar-coded special badge, and they've been through a vetting process and all. Well, this was a cardboard cutout, black and white printed thing with a string on it, and I hung it around my neck, and they said they're asking for you up at the railroad depot, the headquarters. And the reason was that I was a pianist, and growing up, I played for everything in town. I played for church services and for beauty pageants and for the Rotary Club, and just about every kind of thing. And in that small town, there weren't a lot of us around who could do those kinds of things. And so everyone thought of me as the local pianist. there was a man in the campaign, a volunteer, who also taught at Georgia Southwestern with my dad. And his daughter was my friend and was in our high school band. And he was kind of a local, well-known singer. Just as I was frequently playing for things, he was frequently singing at things. And so they had decided that he would lead the crowd in singing God Bless America when the Carters arrived. The Carters, I believe, were in Atlanta, maybe at their national headquarters, and were flying down and going to appear before the cameras in planes. And it was at least insider knowledge inside the railroad depot there with a very local, very small group of campaign staff that I ended up standing with, that the election was turning Carter's way, and it wasn't going to be long before it was called for him. So I had no sheet music. I didn't play God Bless America by ear. I'm not sure I had ever played it in my life. So they kind of cleared the people away from the railroad platform with the cameras not running. And I went out there to the piano and pecked away and figured out the chords and the melody of God Bless America in the key that this singer was likely to need it, and tried to figure out, how to play God Bless America on national TV with no sheet music. And sure enough, it went just as they had suspected. They called the election for Carter. The crowd went crazy. The cameras all started rolling, and they announced that the Carters were on their way from Atlanta and would be there shortly. The crowd all gathered in front of this railroad platform where the piano was. The piano was directly behind the speaker's lectern. So I stood at the piano so that I could sit down on the bench and play when the time came. And the platform started to fill up with people. There was a small choir there ready to sing, the choir from Andrew College down in Cuthbert, Georgia. There were all kinds of local people, most of whom had been friends of Jimmy Carter since childhood and were volunteers in the campaign. There was me, and there was the gentleman who was going to sing. Well, the crowd was so loud and so crazy that when the Carters arrived, we attempted to start God Bless America, but it was completely inaudible, even to us. There was no one going to calm down and sing God Bless America, and we never played or sang the song, but it's what made it necessary for me to be standing there. So the Carters and Jimmy's very famous mother, Miss Lillian Carter, his brother Billy, who had come to notoriety running the local gas station and selling his own beer, all of those people, the children of Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, we're all standing there together, and Jimmy and Rosalind arrive and stand at the speaker's lectern. And it just so happened that because they told me to, I was standing right behind him. And when he appeared on national television to accept that he had won the presidency, to give his victory speech, I just happened to be standing right behind him in my drum major uniform. The next day, the phone rang all day with friends from various places calling my parents and saying, what in the world was Terry doing standing there with Jimmy Carter? And the answer was, it was kind of Forrest Gump. I just happened to be there where they told me to stand, and that happened to be it that night.
Washington, D.C. is a city bustling with activity and rich with history. While in D.C., I took a tour with public historian Rebecca Fackner of some historical sites that highlight Jimmy and Rosalind Carter around America's capital.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Fackner. I am a historian and tour guide in Washington, D.C. I have a podcast of my own, Tour Guide Tell All. We talk about scandals and history and politics and all kinds of fun things, but I'm based in Washington. I talk a lot about the presidents for my job, and that's kind of where I am.
The first stop on our tour was at the National Portrait Gallery. Through the marble pillars and security checkpoints, we made our way up several flights of stairs in search of Carter's portrait.
So, obviously they're in order. It's pretty easy. The one thing to note is that other than Lincoln, Carter's is the only portrait where he's definitely in a room in the White House. Like, James Buchanan's in a room, but it could be any room. And you'll see a bunch of them, they're like at a desk or whatever. But Carter's the only one who's like chosen to be clearly in a defined room.
What's the history behind that?
It was interesting to me, and I looked a lot into it. What they're trying to do with this portrait is Carter wants to be seen in the Oval. This is the seat of power. Like, he's in command, he's the commander-in-chief. And what's so interesting to me about this portrait is it's the central tension for me with Carter's presidency is intention versus execution. And that's really evident in this portrait. He wants to be seen in command. He's in the Oval, in the seat of power, where he makes decisions, where he sends people into harm's way. He's surrounded by, you can clearly tell that that's supposed to be Ben Franklin and George Washington. He's got his hand on the desk, leader of his party, leader of the country, all that power. But what ends up happening with this, they want to show him in command, but because they want to show so much of the Oval, he looks diminished in the portrait. And so he looks small in comparison to this massive room that he's in. The expression, the fact that he's got his hand in his pocket looks almost questioning, diffident, sort of uncertain. Even his stance, he's very straight. There's no stride to this. There's no movement. He's very still. He's not moving. He looks very thin. He looks diminished. And so that's, I think, what a really central tension of Carter, for me, is he wants to do the right thing, has a lot of good intentions, but the execution of it just doesn't quite work.
It's kind of a metaphor for the way that we remember his presidency now.
Yes, very much.
Next, we stepped outside on a gorgeous spring day to head a few blocks south down 8th Street toward a D.C. landmark with a unique connection to Carter. So where are we standing right now?
We are standing in the Naval Memorial. So this is in the center of Washington, D.C. We're across from the National Archives where the Constitution is, and that's where they chose to put the Naval Memorial, central. What you're seeing is the lone sailor. You're seeing the map of the world, but inverted. So because it's the Navy, the sea is highlighted as opposed to the land. I chose this spot for two reasons. One, obviously, Carter's went to the Naval Academy. He had a Navy career, the only president of the United States to go to Annapolis, although not the only to serve in the Navy. And I also chose this particular spot because it's on the inaugural parade route. So that's behind us. What's behind us is Pennsylvania Avenue. And to this day, inaugurations, when they do an inauguration, they parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. Carter's inauguration is really unique in a couple of ways. First of all, he has the last inauguration on the east lawn of the Capitol. Reagan's going to move it to the west lawn, which is where we're familiar with seeing it today. Carter also is going to have business dress at his inauguration, not formal wear. That's something Reagan does away with and goes back to the formal wear, which we have to this day. Carter wants a more relaxed inauguration. He also is going to get out at the beginning of the parade route and insist in 28-degree weather on walking with his wife the entire way down the parade route, which is about a mile and a half down Pennsylvania Avenue. So it really sets the tone in so many ways for Carter's presidency, what he's trying to do, outreach to the people. You're seeing the idea of a more laid back and relaxed presidential style. You're also seeing Carter makes a very lovely appeal to his predecessor, Gerald Ford, at the beginning of his inauguration. So he's appealing to forgiveness and healing. We want to bring the country together. That's kind of what Carter's big deal is when he's starting out. And so you're seeing that from the very beginning. The Naval Memorial, his career in the Navy is so important, particularly to him and Rosalind. They move around a good bit. And so I thought that this was a good spot to kind of talk about that. But the real nugget, the parade route, the inauguration sort of sets the tone for his whole presidency, not in just what he's trying to do, but what he actually does do and how the press receives it. The press is not especially warm to the idea of this more relaxed style. Carter tries to play down the inaugural balls. That's not well received. They want a big party in Washington. And so that's going to be a part of what happens with Carter. And so you're seeing the beginning of the media really being unfriendly to him as soon as he takes office.
En route to our last stop, we crossed Pennsylvania Avenue and made our way to one of the many Smithsonian museums that line the National Mall. I asked Rebecca about President Carter's relationship with Rosalind and the often underappreciated influence that First Ladies have on shaping the presidency.
I honestly think we should talk more about First Ladies overall, but particularly in Rosalind Carter's case, she's such the evolution of their relationship, not just during their presidency, but their whole evolution is so interesting. And she really does a lot of modernization of the office.
He seemed to really go out of his way to support that,
Yes.
like to elevate her. Like, he's arguably the first president to go out of his way to elevate what she's doing and kind of change that.
I absolutely do. I think that that's very important. I think the strength of their bond is important. Like, if you look at presidents, this isn't 100% true, but generally if they have a good, strong bond with their spouse, they tend out to be a better president. And the weaker ones tend to either have not had a spouse or just not a great relationship. And I think his bond with Rosalind, like, when you get to that level, you need somebody who can tell you that you're full of it, because so many people won't.
The Museum of American History provided a fitting end to our tour. Carter connections can be seen in many exhibits highlighting diverse topics, from foreign diplomacy to the history of recorded sound. But continuing our discussion of the central role that First Lady Rosalind played in her husband's presidency, it was an exhibit highlighting her that truly captured the zeitgeist of the Carter years.
We are in the First Lady's dress exhibit in the American History Museum. The First Lady's inaugural ball gowns from their husband's first or only inauguration are in chronological order. So Rosalind Carter's, Nancy Reagan's, Barbara Bush's, etc. Rosalind Carter's dress is really unique. It's very 70s. It's very of its moment. She reuses this dress. So this is actually the dress that she's going to wear when Jimmy gets inaugurated as governor of Georgia. She figures in 1977, as they're preparing for the inauguration, the Carters want a more dressed down sort of vibe. They want something a little more, not casual, that's the wrong characterization, but more everyman. And so rather than have the inaugural committee spend a lot of money on a couture gown, she says, well, I already have one. It fits, it looks really great, and it does. Why don't I just wear that? And so it symbolizes home economics. We're in the midst of the economy's a little iffy. Why don't we just reuse something? Thinking that this would appeal. Why have the American people spend extra money for the First Lady to show up in a couture gown? However, it backfires massively on both of the Carters. She is lambasted in the press. She doesn't understand the office she has assumed. She doesn't understand her husband's office. She doesn't respect the office. How dare she reuse and recycle something? That's just not done. She's no longer the First Lady of Georgia. She's now the First Lady of the United States. And she gets hit very hard in the press for this, right out of the gate. And it's a really unfair, I think, hit. I think the press does not do the Carters any favors in this moment. They're trying to do something really nice, and it's painted as disrespectful and almost like they're rubes coming from, nowhere to the White House. And it just is a really unfortunate illustration of sort of where the country is. And you can see the next dress over is Nancy Reagan's inaugural ball gown from 4 years later. It's glamorous, it's couture, it's sequins. You're immediately seeing the shift to Hollywood glamour. And so you're seeing the shift in the culture from more traditional, the Carters and their Plains, Georgia beginnings, to Nancy Reagan and Hollywood, glamour, glitz, the 80s. And so you're seeing that cultural shift almost in real time happening with these two dresses. And so that's kind of what I think about with Rosalind Carter's. It's a lovely dress. It's very 70s, but it's lovely. She looks lovely in it. It's very appropriate for a woman of her age. It's very appropriate for a First Lady, but it's seen as casual. It's seen as disrespectful. It's seen as not glamorous enough. And so that's what you're seeing here is a sort of metaphor for the entire Carter presidency. They're not trying hard enough. They're not working hard enough. They aren't glamorous enough. And you can see immediately that shift to Reagan with the opera length gloves and the very Hollywood glitz. And so that's what this cultural moment is between the late 70s and the early 80s.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart.
President Carter's Crisis of Confidence speech, delivered on July 15, 1978, is considered one of the most iconic moments of his presidency. So how did we come to profoundly misremember it today?
Hi, I'm Amber Rosner, professor at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I'm originally from Winder, Georgia, and I attended the University of Georgia's College of Journalism and Mass Communication. I got my PhD from there in 2010 and began work around that time on a book about the rise of Jimmy Carter in the 1976 campaign. and his presidency.
When we think about presidents, world leaders, we often think about speeches, public speaking. That's often the way that they're remembered, whether it's Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address or John F. Kennedy's "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," right? Like, these are some of the iconic moments that we remember. For Carter, probably his most remembered public speaking event is the Crisis of Confidence speech. Was that fair to say, you think?
I think that's pretty fair. And most people would not remember it as the Crisis of Confidence speech, but instead the malaise speech.
Right. And so there is some really interesting historical context around the speech and thinking about this idea of the way that we remember presidents in general, but especially Carter. There's some really unusual things that have happened with the way that we think about and remember this particular speech. So let's start with some of that historical context about why does Carter come on air and make this speech to begin with?
Well, the first thing I'll say is I think this is probably one of the most misremembered, misunderstood speeches of any president, quite frankly. So we talked about a moment ago this idea that it's often referred to as the malaise speech. Malaise is not even in the text of the speech at all, right? It gets this moniker because of a critic that comes on, right, and refers to it as the malaise speech. To fully understand this speech, you definitely have to understand the context. Carter is on a plane. He's just settling in for an 8-hour flight to Hawaii, where he plans on taking a much needed break for a couple of days. He's just completed a 2-leg journey. He had met with some Soviet leaders to sign the SALT II treaty, and he had engaged in an economic summit meeting in Japan. And so in many respects, man, he's looking forward to a break after a successful foreign policy trip. And he gets a phone call aboard the plane, and it's his pollster, Pat Caddell. He says, "You've got to come home now. You have no idea how bad it is." Caddell, of course, was referring to the long gas lines that had erupted in California and spread across the United States. And they were a product of the very severe gas shortage that was fueled by a recent OPEC-induced rise in prices. And what Caddell encouraged Carter to do was to have a direct talk with the American public about a subject that he had come to them with time and time again. This idea of the energy crisis and energy conservation that needed to happen. That said, this is a moment in which Carter's public approval ratings had slipped to 25%. That's lower than Nixon's at the height of Watergate. So the American public, they weren't very happy with Carter. His Imagecraft team thought maybe that this should be a reboot kind of moment. What ultimately happens, he's scheduled to give his talk around the energy crisis, and he pulls back. He cancels it, and he heads over to Camp David. He sees this as an important strategic pause. He recognizes that his administration is in danger, and over the next 10 days, which some journalists compare that moment to the 10 days surrounding the Cuban Missile Crisis. They say Carter's on the mountaintop, right, getting advisors across the country to come up and share their critiques, to share their potential solutions with Carter. And it is this moment where everyone's like, what is he doing? When he comes down from the mountaintop, so to speak, he delivers an incredibly remarkable address that will change the course of his presidency.
Good evening. This is a special night for me. exactly 3 years ago, on July 15th, 1976, I accepted the nomination of my party to run for President of the United States.
So the key part of the historical context that leads up to the speech is an energy crisis. And Carter had been acknowledging that and working on that. He was coming back from a trip to work on these issues and other economic issues facing not just America, but the globe. How then does he go from just making another address about the energy crisis to this sort of theoretical address to a deeper philosophical or moral problem that he felt the nation was facing?
I really think that stems in part from he's seeing that polling data, this idea that his public approval rating is less than Nixon's. And he's also seeing polling data from Pat Caddell that continues to signal that America is still in a moment of a crisis of confidence in its institutions and its leaders. And that crisis of confidence hasn't been triggered by an energy crisis or by any kind of foreign conflict, but instead, the stage had been set for that crisis of confidence in the 60s, right, with Vietnam, that credibility crisis that had emerged, and with the assassinations of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Kennedy brothers. So it's a much deeper crisis. And you're right, Carter saw it as a moment in which our country needed transformation because they had completely lost faith in our government and its leaders.
I promised you a president who is not isolated from the people, who feels your pain and who shares your dreams, and who draws his strength and his wisdom from you.
Let's talk a little bit about the actual content of the speech. You already mentioned that it's known today as the Malaise speech, but the word Malaise doesn't appear. What does appear in the speech? What is Carter saying? And how is that message received in the immediate aftermath in the days right after the speech is given?
So first of all, I think it's important in the immediate aftermath to the speech, he immediately picks up like 11 points in public approval ratings. So the speech has been misunderstood, misrepresented in terms of hurting his public approval rating. So initial signs were, man, the speech worked. Carter, 2 days later, asks everyone in his cabinet to turn in a letter of resignation. And that undercut any gains because it sent a signal that Carter didn't have faith in his own leadership team. And so I think that that's important to recognize, that the speech itself was actually pretty well received. And polling data suggest that if the speech were given today, that it would be equally well received. And it's because of the themes in that speech. This idea of recognizing and acknowledging that citizens were aptly frustrated with institutions and leaders. One of the individuals that Carter quotes in his speech is, as he puts it, a young Chicano man who said, "Some of us have suffered from recession all our lives." And this was just one of the individuals that Carter had asked to come voice concerns and to offer solutions in that 10 days prior. So the first part of his speech is just that, acknowledging critique that was directed at him. So a Southern governor had said, "Mr. President, you're not leading the nation. You're just managing the government. You don't see the people enough anymore. Some of your cabinet members don't seem loyal. There's not enough discipline among your disciples." Someone had said, "We're really in a period of moral and spiritual crises." And that was, for Carter, the summative statement in a notebook full of statements that he had recorded during that 10-day period. What he was hoping to address that night was this moral and spiritual crisis of confidence.
So I want to speak to you first tonight about a subject even more serious than energy or inflation. I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. I do not mean our political and civil liberties. They will endure. And I do not refer to the outward strength of America, a nation that is at peace tonight everywhere in the world, with unmatched economic power and military might. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence.
After setting the stage, he really does acknowledge that people are losing their faith not only in the government itself, but in their ability as citizens to shape our democracy. And it was an incredibly powerful acknowledgement. At this turning point in our history, he suggests that we all have a role to play. That first we must face the truth, and then we have to work to change the course. And he shared what one visitor had said: we've got to stop crying and start sweating, stop talking and start walking, stop cursing and start praying. The strength we need will not come from the White House, but from every house in America. So the idea was that every citizen had a role to play, not only in solving the energy crisis, but also in solving the spiritual and moral crisis that the United States found itself in.
It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
Biographer Kai Bird published The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter in 2021. Kai is a prolific author, most notably of American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which earned he and his co-author a Pulitzer Prize in 2006 and became a major motion picture in 2023. I got a chance to talk with Kai about the role he sees biographers playing in the formation of collective memory.
My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Center for Biography at City University in New York. And I'm a biographer, and I've written 5 biographies and a memoir. And my last biography was on Jimmy Carter. And I guess my most famous biography is American Prometheus, co-authored with Martin Sherwin, which is a biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and was the basis for the Christopher Nolan film that came out last year.
That kind of attention draws a lot of opportunities. You won the Pulitzer for that book. I'm interested to know why you were interested in writing about Carter. You could probably choose anyone that you wanted to write about. So why Carter?
Well, I've always been interested in Carter. He was the first president I could vote for when I was a young man back in 1976. I was an editor at The Nation magazine in the late 70s and early 80s, and we always were curious about Carter. The Nation is quite liberal, and we thought Carter wasn't liberal enough. But he was obviously A very interesting and singular American politician. I was just curious about all sorts of things, from where he had come from to what kind of a Southern liberal was he and why he didn't get reelected. In 1990, a long time ago, I actually explored the notion of doing a biography of Jimmy Carter. This is right after my first biography on John J. McCloy. And I did so by writing a cover magazine story in The Nation about what Jimmy Carter was doing with his ex-presidency. He had just opened the Carter Center in 1990. So I went down to Georgia and spent 2 weeks interviewing a number of his people at the Carter Center. I had a telephone interview with Carter himself. I wrote the magazine story, but I left Georgia thinking that I was the wrong guy to do a biography of Jimmy Carter. I didn't understand what a foreign country it was down there. I didn't understand their accents. I didn't understand Southern Baptists. I didn't understand race and its role in Southern culture. I came back and I told my wife that if I were to do a biography of Jimmy Carter, I'd have to move to Plains, Georgia, and spend a couple of years seeping into this foreign country like a foreign correspondent would. And my wife said, no way. So I backed off the project, but I was always curious about it. And I came back to it many books later in 2015 and decided that I really wanted to do a president, and Carter was still a mystery to me. I wrote a proposal, and that same month that I sold the book proposal to a New York publisher, Carter had his famous press conference in which he came out and announced that he had brain cancer. And I thought, oh, I'm never going to get a chance to see the man, talk to him. But as we all know, he survived brain cancer and is still with us to this very day. He's approaching his 100th birthday on October 1st. I spent 6 years working on this Carter biography, and it came out in 2021.
The biography is called The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. I'm really interested in both aspects of that title, but I think we'll start with the first. So, The Outlier. Why do you see Carter as an outlier?
Well, it just seemed very obvious to me that he was a Southern man, but a liberal in the South in the 1950s and 60s. He was an interesting politician, very wily, clever. Even, Hunter Thompson, the famous Rolling Stone journalist who became quite close to Carter in the 70s, called him ruthless, the most ruthless politician he'd ever met. And yet, of course, we all see Jimmy Carter today as one of the most decent politicians in American history, certainly in the 20th century. He ran as a governor, as an outlier. He was always surprising his constituency. He was a Southern man, Southern white man, but he was extremely liberal in his positions on race and religion and separation of church and state. And he won the White House in 1976, coming from nowhere, so to speak. Then he proceeded to govern as an outlier. He told his wife, Rosie, that he wasn't going to take political factors into his decision-making. He was going to do the right thing. He was going to just try to figure out what was the right thing to do, study the issue, and do the right thing. And this, again, made him an outlier. So I thought it was a good title, and it captured his personality. Then the subtitle, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter, is, I thought, appropriate as well, because, of course, he had only one term, so his presidency as such was unfinished. And the subtitle hints at what he did with the rest of his life, which is he really extended his presidency into his ex-presidency, working very hard on the same issues that had captivated him during his White House years: Middle East peace, health issues, wiping out guinea worm disease in Africa. Again, trying to do the right thing and not just use his ex-presidency to take $1 million checks for giving speeches. So,
a common phrase used about Carter is good man, but not a great president.
He hates that.
Right. So much of my interest in doing this podcast has been to explore that phrase that's really a maxim for many, especially from the conservative side. With you having done extensive research on Carter, what's your assessment of that phrase?
Well, he did have a very successful and model ex-presidency, and he is very much a decent man. But it's a myth that his presidency was a failure. He actually had a quite consequential 4 years in the White House, and he dealt with many of the same issues that are still relevant today, from energy to race to religion to climate change, to healthcare. And during his White House years, he actually got quite a lot done, from the relatively minor thing of deregulating the alcohol industry so that boutique beer breweries could pop up in every American city, and Americans today are drinking good beer instead of watered down Budweiser. He also saved 10,000 lives a year to this day by passing seatbelts and airbag legislation in our automobiles. He deregulated the trucking industry. He deregulated the airlines, which allowed for the first time for middle-class Americans to fly on their Thanksgiving vacations or Christmas holidays. Before that, Americans would drive, but during the Carter presidency and afterwards, middle-class Americans began to fly in large numbers. He passed the Alaska Land Act. He appointed more African Americans and women to the federal bench than all of his predecessors combined. He created the modern vice presidency, moving the vice president's office into the White House grounds. And on foreign policy, he had a long list of achievements, from the Panama Canal Treaty to the SALT II arms negotiations to normalization of diplomatic relations with China, to immigration reform. And of course, he made human rights in foreign policy a keystone of US foreign policy, and it has remained so ever since. And of course, he did this extraordinary negotiation at Camp David over 13 days in September 1978, where most improbably, due to his very personal diplomacy, he brought together Egypt's Anwar Sadat and Israel's Menachem Begin and hammered out, really arm wrestled them into a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, which survives to this day. But I have to say also that his failures are just as interesting as his successes. He negotiated this Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, but he also thought he had gotten an agreement with Menachem Begin to address Palestinian self-determination. And of course, Begin, as we now know, reneged on that part of the negotiations. And so we're now, as a result, dealing with the Palestinian-Israeli conundrum to this day. Of course, his presidency was probably in large measure brought down by the Iran hostage crisis, 444 days. And again, this is an interesting aspect of his presidency. He probably could have ended this crisis by bombing the hell out of Iran or mining the harbors, but he felt that that would endanger the lives of the hostages, and he was determined to bring them back. So again, he did the right thing at great political cost and relied on diplomacy. This led to the perception in the 1980 presidential campaign against Ronald Reagan that Carter was the weaker of the two. And as we know, he lost in the landslide in that 1980 election.
What do you think are some of the factors that feed in to our collective memory of Carter today, especially the presidency, which, as you just said, was much more consequential than is commonly remembered? But why do we remember Carter the way that we do?
Americans have a short historical memory, alas. And Carter's presidency was more than 40 years ago now. The younger generation has no knowledge of it personally. The older generation of Americans, again, remember Carter in sort of his stereotyped images, his sitting in a sweater in front of a fireplace, lecturing us about how to save energy. They remember the Iran hostage crisis and those helicopters that went down in a failed rescue mission. They don't remember the victories and the consequential decisions that he made that actually changed the economy and much of American culture for the better. I think if you pick up The Outlier, most readers will be astonished at the history that they don't know and have forgotten. But in fact, Carter is looking better and better these days, certainly in the eyes of historians. He, in my view, was absolutely the most intelligent and hardworking and decent man to have occupied the Oval Office in the 20th century. He kept farmer hours. He got up at 5:30 in the morning. He was in the Oval Office by 6 or 6:30, and he worked 12 hours a day and read 300 memos every day, 200 to 300 pages of memos. He paid attention to the details. He was hardworking, and you would think that this is a quality that we would want in our presidency. I think history will judge Jimmy Carter as the president ahead of his times and somewhat of a prophet about climate change, about solar panels on the roof of the White House, a prophet in terms of his views of what was necessary to bring peace to the Middle East. And he was willing to tackle these tough, unpopular issues like the Panama Canal Treaty or Middle East peace, despite the political consequences and the political costs, which he knew were going to be heavy.
I'm interested as we wrap up to ask you, what role do you think biography or even yourself as a biographer play in shaping collective memory? If you had a hope for how your biography of Carter might change the way that we remember him, what would it be?
Well, biography, I would argue, is the most arduous form of scholarship. It's unending. Most biographies take the biographer at least 5 years to research and write, and often many more years. My first biography took 10 years. This Carter biography took 6. It's a very difficult form of scholarship, but it is also the most readable form of history. It's storytelling. It's a story of one person's life. And for that reason, it can be very powerful. It can be a page turner. We're all curious about our individual lives. And if you take a character like Jimmy Carter and follow him through his own life, you learn a lot of history and context about not only the issues, but the culture, the times. And it's a powerful tool. People, I would argue, should read more biography. They would find it pleasurable and they would find it engrossing, and they would learn a lot along the way, a lot of history that they otherwise would not read. So biography is an essential tool for human understanding, for understanding our human condition.
The concept of collective memory has been the guiding theme of this podcast. I asked Dr. Janice Hume to define collective memory and to explain the unique place that American presidents hold in it. We discussed how Carter's long life has had a unique effect on our collective memory of him and how that memory might continue to evolve after his passing.
This is Janice Hume. I am a professor at the University of Georgia's College of Journalism and Mass Communication, and I hold the Carolyn McKenzie and Don E. Carter Chair in Journalism Excellence.
And that Carter is related to President Carter, is that right?
They were cousins, and Don Carter was a media executive in Knight Ridder back in the day, and I think first cousin to Jimmy Carter.
You are an expert in what historians call collective memory. Let's start by talking just about what that is, and then we'll think a little bit more about how that relates to President Carter.
Sure. So collective memory is the way we think about the past as a society And it's very interesting because collective memory really is more about the needs of the present, sometimes than actually what happened in the past. It's a way a culture or a society or a community or a business remembers its past, but always keeping in mind that memory really kind of serves our current needs.
And so with that, we can remember celebrities, we can remember someone that was just famous by circumstance or a news event. What's unique about the memory of political figures? And in this context, especially with something like American presidents?
Political figures get a lot of press coverage. They have a lot of stories told about them. But even our earliest political figures, there's something about the presidency that solidifies your place in American collective memory. And so when I'm talking about how memory serves the needs of the present, think about George Washington. In the early days of our country, people really put him up on a pedestal. I mean, you see paintings of George Washington with the angels. George Washington was somebody that we could never aspire to become. But then as our country became more egalitarian, we believe that people are equal, right? And so the memories of George Washington became more egalitarian. So he became a person with flaws. He became a person that we admire, but who is now out of the reach of someone like me becoming. The memory of George Washington changed when we get to the turn of the century and the Industrial Revolution. We remember his entrepreneurial spirit. George Washington, long dead and buried, hasn't changed, but the way we remember him changed just because our interest and needs are different. So presidents are uniquely visible in our culture, and historians write about presidents, and we tell stories about presidents, and they have records that are nuanced, and there's public criticism of a president. How is that remembered 50 years after that president is gone? So presidents are unique. They hold a special place in our collective memory, and that memory morphs and changes.
Some of the presidents that have had big shifts in memory over time, Washington would certainly be one, Lincoln would be one. Your historical expertise is primarily in the colonial era and in the 1800s, but you have your own personal memory of Carter's presidency. Let's talk a little bit about how he was covered in the press at the time, how contemporary collective memory memorialized him, and then how you've seen it change over the years.
The first time I ever voted in a presidential election was his second bid for the presidency, the one that he lost. So I was a kid. His first term was at the end of my high school days and the beginning of my college days. What I remember was the Iranian hostage crisis, which is sort of what everybody remembers about Jimmy Carter. The big things of his presidency, I have vague memories of being aware of and understanding, like Camp David and the Panama Canal, various things that he is remembered for in his presidency. I do remember. The question is, do I remember them because I was focused in at the time, or do I remember them because that's what we remember about his presidency? And those two things are really hard to separate. My memory of Jimmy Carter visually during his presidency are those big caricatures with his big grin, the peanut farmer. And those visuals are very different from the way I think of Jimmy Carter now. The visuals I have of him now in my psyche are him building houses for Habitat when he's, an elderly person, or him having pictures made with people outside his church after he's taught Sunday school. Those are the images that I think of now with Carter.
With Carter, we've got a really unique setup for a shift in collective memory. The announcement was made over President's Day weekend in February 2023 that he had been released to home hospice care. It was covered widely in the news that weekend. And then there have been sporadic packages about different things. There was a bombshell story in the New York Times about the Iranian hostage crisis. How might those things affect our collective memory of Carter?
I think it's so interesting, and it's just a sign of our times in terms of this announcement of hospice care in this period of time that people can pay tribute to him while he's still alive and can fully understand what people are saying about him. I think that's a really 21st century phenomenon in terms of medical care, but also in terms of our media coverage. We have a moment when a president is still alive. It's almost like attending your own funeral. People are pouring out their sort of respect and their memories of Carter. And like most obituaries, they're very positive. Usually that happens after someone's gone, but now it's happening in this period of time that he is under hospice care, still with his family, still with us. This outpouring of tribute and memory is very, I think, unique. And I think it has to do with the fact that we can die at home now with hospice care, that they announced it so that people could process. He lives there in this little tiny town in Georgia, and I think it was a kindness to them to announce it so that people could process what his death will mean.
This episode was released on October 1st, 2024, which is also Jimmy Carter's 100th birthday. Carter is the first former American president to reach that milestone, and he reached it against the odds. Over the past decade of his life, he has had numerous health issues and even endured the loss of his beloved wife, Rosalind, on November 19, 2023. As Dr. Hume mentioned in our interview, Carter's long life has created a new phenomenon in the history of American presidential collective memory. Rather than seeing that memory recollect and begin to shift upon a president's passing, in Carter's case, we have seen a longer, more gradual shift that has been tied to ongoing developments in American politics, popular culture, and world events. When I began working on this series, I was originally inspired by Dr. Hume's work on collective memory, thus the title Recollecting or Recollecting Carter. Prior to becoming a historian, I think my own understanding of Carter's career was fairly typical. I knew he had been president, of course, a bit about his humanitarian work with Habitat for Humanity, but that was really it. I did not know the extent of that work or that it was based right here in Atlanta, Georgia at the Carter Center. Sharing a campus with Carter's Presidential Library and Museum, this place fosters some of the most innovative and effective efforts at eradicating disease, encouraging democracy, and alleviating human suffering that happen anywhere in the world. Oh, and there's a farmer's market every Saturday morning. I'm actually here now. The more I learned about President Carter, the more I questioned what I thought I knew. How is it that we came to remember a man that created the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, and brokered a deal to establish peace in the Middle East as a failed president? The short answer, as we have learned over the course of this podcast, is the media. Dr. Amber Rosner talked to us about how Carter and his campaign team effectively used mediums such as television, radio, and print journalism to get one of the most long-shot candidates in American presidential history into office. Yet, the media magic they made on the campaign trail never materialized once Carter was in office. In fact, Carter actively put other priorities ahead of his public image, almost always choosing to follow principle over political expedience. That attitude of ambivalence about his public image and of antagonism toward the press ultimately cost him a second term. We also heard from historians like A.J. Bauer, Paul Matzko, Katie Burnell, and Kevin Cruz about the role that news media have played in shaping collective memory of President Carter. Through their work, we can see the exponential increase of media influence on American public life since 1976. The convergence of constant news coverage with popular culture and entertainment media helped get Carter elected in 1976, but it ultimately gave rise to figures like Rush Limbaugh, who had a vested interest in denigrating Carter and his accomplishments. Carter's choice to focus on building affordable housing rather than his own reputation during his post-presidential years has made him vulnerable to attacks from conservative critics, but he has largely chosen to ignore them. However, I think that many of the historical events we have discussed on this podcast suggest our memory of the man may change significantly as we are forced to grapple with a world he did his best to prepare us for. As climate change forces us to alter the ways we use energy and fossil fuels, I believe we will regret not following Carter's visionary plan to make America energy independent by the year 2000. As geopolitical forces continue to create devastating and costly wars and to manufacture refugee crises at our own borders that we cannot ignore, we will see the wisdom of benevolent investment in the stability and prosperity of poorer nations before they are on the brink of collapse. We will also wish that Carter's foreign policy principles centered in human rights had been followed more closely by the presidents from both sides of the aisle that came after him. Carter was quoted in 2015 after the infamous Citizens United Supreme Court decision as saying that the United States was no longer effectively a democracy, but an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. Later in that same interview, Carter said that to overturn Citizens United, it would likely take a, quote, horrible, disgraceful series of acts in our country that turns the public against it, and eventually maybe even the Congress and the Supreme Court, end quote. For me, it's difficult not to view that remark as a chillingly prophetic prediction of the storming of the Capitol by followers of Donald Trump on January 6, 2021. As political theater and people of no principle dominate our 24-hour news cycle, perhaps we will reconsider the value of a leader like Carter, who, despite his mistakes and flaws, was always willing to put the good of the country ahead of his own selfish ambition. Apart from media influence, the other major theme of the podcast has been the centrality of Carter's faith to our collective memory of him. Guests like Neil J. Young, Gil Frank, Russell Moore, David Nanninga, Beth Allison Barr, and Benji Rolski all had unique insight into the ways that Carter's Christian faith intersected with politics and popular culture. A question I returned to with several guests was, why do you think so many American evangelicals despise the most Christian president America has ever had? If I may, I'd like to share a bit more here about my own interest in Carter and in how this podcast came to be. I was born in 1981, just a few months after Carter left office. Ronald Reagan is the first president that I remember, and as a teen in the 1990s, I certainly was aware of the scandals during Clinton's tenure, but I was much more interested in music and hanging out with my friends than I was in politics. I really didn't think about Jimmy Carter at all until I was in my early 20s. At that time, I attended a church that saw involvement in politics as both a civic and a religious duty. I remember distinctly hearing Carter described as a good man, but not a great president, by a member of senior leadership from the pulpit on a Sunday morning. That seemed odd to me even at the time, but it would still be several more years before I saw just how weird, to borrow vice presidential candidate Tim Walz's phrase, it really was. I left that church in 2008 to go back to college, but not before I got a front row seat to the ways that white American evangelicals spoke about Barack Obama, first as a candidate and then as a president. Later, I watched in horror and disbelief as so many people claiming to believe in Jesus Christ, whom the Bible describes as a humble servant, a healer, and the Prince of Peace, rally around someone who bragged about sexual assault, took every opportunity to promote division and hate, and threatened violence to anyone that opposed him. I actually know personally some of the people that have claimed to be Trump's spiritual advisors, and I've seen many people I know and care about get so caught up in the cult of Trump's personality that they are almost unrecognizable. There was a moment in 2019 that Carter, despite the way Trump had repeatedly denigrated him and his legacy, wrote a letter offering advice on relations with China. In the media coverage of that event, I happened to catch an image of the two men side by side on a news broadcast. That was when the contrast really hit me. To see how the American church had dismissed Carter, a self-described Christian missionary in his post-presidential years, while embracing Trump, was eye-opening to say the least. It was almost like the story in the Bible when the crowd are offered a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, and they chose a murderer and an insurrectionist over the Son of God. That was for me the moment that I decided I wanted to learn more about Jimmy Carter. It's been quite a journey since that train ride to Plains to record my first episode, and I'm very thankful to my guests and the support I've received along the way. From historians like Randall Stevens, to culture scholars like Rachel Grant, to political scientists like Jason Berggren, we've heard from a wide range of perspectives. Carter's recent biographers were guests on the show as well. Picking up a copy of Jonathan Alter's His Very Best, or Kai Bird's The Outlier, would be a great way to continue to learn more about America's 39th president. I've also enjoyed watching recent documentaries like Rock and Roll President and Carterland, and events like the Jimmy Carter 100 concert, sponsored by the Carter Center right here in Atlanta, that have come out recently. Carter has reportedly said that he is excited to vote for Kamala Harris in the upcoming election, and I'm sure he will be in the news regularly over the next few weeks and perhaps beyond. Time will tell how our collective memory of Carter evolves, but in this moment, his example of principled politics and faith in action invites us to reevaluate how we define a successful presidency. At the very least, Carter's example shows us that a politics of morality and decency is possible. Whether or not we choose it is up to us. Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.